Hi everyone, this is Ece Gurler Art. Graphite and charcoal, they are two very different mediums. What are the differences between these two pencil types and which one is the best for you? I drew the same portrait with graphite pencil and with charcoal. Here is the result. If you are new to my channel, I create educational tutorials, drawing and painting tutorials for you. And if you want to show your support, you can either subscribe to this channel or you can go to my Patreon. Before we begin, I showed in this tutorial how to actually mix charcoal and graphite. If you're interested in watching it, it's just right here for you. Now, let's see the differences between charcoal and graphite. As you can see here, I have two different drafts for two different drawings, one graphite and one charcoal. The first one, let's talk about giving details. With graphite, I found it easier to give details as I could get a much better fine point with my graphite pencils. You can see me drawing here with Kohinoor woodless, and it was amazing to give all these hair detail, all these eyebrows and eyelashes. And also on the lips too, you can see that all the lip lines were easily drawn by my graphite pencils. I think in overall it's fair to say that it is much easier to give details with graphite pencils. And even for the hair, it is more realistic with graphite pencils because I could give all those hair details with my fine point. Of course, you need to sharpen your graphite pencil here, and you can make different shades like 3B, 6B, and maybe even HB for the shorter hairs. How about charcoal, you say? So giving details with charcoal is a little bit more difficult as it is thicker and it is much darker, but at the same time you can still do it. As you can see here, I'm giving all these iris line details with my sharpened charcoal pencil. But if you're going to give details, definitely you need to use either medium or hard charcoal pencil. It is very difficult to give those with soft ones or extra soft ones. And the lips too, I think the lines were a little bit darker than the graphite ones, so they're not my favorite in terms of giving the realistic look, but definitely they are darker, so that gives a better contrast. But we will talk about contrast much later. Here you see me giving details on the lip with my medium charcoal pencil. And when it comes to hair, my strategy is usually to color it to black and then go in with my eraser pencil, especially for this photo because he has black hair and also it is pretty dark out there. But you can see that when I'm trying to give the fine hair details, although it's still good, I think with graphite I got much better finer points. But when I erase, because charcoal pencils are darker, I can see my eraser lines much better. How about shading? So graphite shading requires a few layers, at least 3-4 layers if you are drawing realistically. Here you can see that I'm doing 3B and then I'm going with my 6B. And I'm going to blend them, and after that I'm going to do my second layer, third layer, fourth layer. Even sometimes I do more pressure to less pressure to give those grades. So definitely it requires more effort and it requires more time in that sense. Here you see me doing the third layer because it's pretty dark there in the photo. Look how I'm holding my pencil though. When I'm shading, I'm holding it from the back. When I'm giving details though, I am much closer to the tip of my pencil. Here the shade is pretty dark, and in order to get this dark shade, I did many layers, but then I see the strokes of my pencil. I didn't like that, so I came up with this solution. Because I have woodless Kohinoor, I created this graphite dust, and with this graphite powder, when I tried my blending stump, honestly it didn't give a very dark result, but when I tried with my fingers instead, it created a much darker result. And I applied it everywhere, of course. Well, shading with charcoal is really fun. Let me show you a method for this. So I have my charcoal here and I can create charcoal dust with the help of my X-Acto knife, and I dip my watercolor brush, or any kind of brush really, there, and I apply it gently to my paper. Here is if I'm putting on makeup, I'm adding all the shadows, all the midtones, like dark midtones, and then I blend them with a tissue, of course. When it comes to the narrower areas like the lip, for shading, I get the help from my blending stump or the Q-tips. And let's compare the large area. You can see that it's much easier than the graphite to give the darker shade, to blend it this way. So I just used my fingers and it was there. I don't need to do multiple layers with charcoal, only 1 or 2 is enough if you have a lot of dust on your brush. Graphite blending is easy. Here you can see me using my blending stump to go over those lines, and eye lines are the perfect places to use your blending stump because we want to keep them dark. And also you can use the graphite that is smudged on your blending stump and continue shading with that. Higher B grade graphites will smudge much more easily. You can blend them much easier than the H ones. And I think I used here either 3B or 6B, so you can see that it is blending very well. So this makes my shading much more easier. Another thing I want to talk to you about when it comes to shading is, of course, the face, the other parts of the face. After I do each layer, I go over with my tissue and blend it so that it gives a more natural look, and then I go in with my second and third and fourth layers. And for blending the ears, honestly, I think the Q-tips are the best options here because they give a much softer look in comparison to blending stumps, and also it preserves some blackness in comparison to when we blend with a tissue. And of course, my fingers. You can see that I'm blending with my fingers here. I usually don't like to use my fingers, especially with graphite, but for larger areas like this, if I'm using the powders, then definitely I do. And for the excessive amount of graphite, I can use it on the face, wherever I see that it needs some shadow. And for the lips, you see that blending stump works perfectly. For charcoal blending, as I said before, I use the brush most of the time for this portrait, and then I blend it with my tissue. You can see that it smoothens it out and it creates a basic layer, and on top of it, of course, I'm going to go with more charcoal, and of course I'm going to erase more, and then it's gonna be much better. Here in the eye details and narrower parts, I used my Q-tip. And if I want to preserve the blackness of things, I prefer the blending stump. Here on the nose, the shadows on the nose are much softer, so I preferred my Q-tip as well. But each time I add a shadow, I went over with my tissue to make them look more natural and realistic. For lips too, you see that I added all these dark shadows, but it's going to lighten up now when we apply our tissue, you will see. So in order to preserve the darkness, again, I go in with my blending stump and then I go with my tissue. Do you see how much it lightened up? Wow. And these areas, the shadows like under the lower lip, I want to preserve them too, so I use the Q-tip from downward to upward motions. And the mouth line needs to stay dark because it creates contrast, so I used my blending stump. When it comes to the clothing part, of course, fingers are the best because that actually fills up all the white of the tooth for me. If I, for example, use a tissue here, it actually removes the charcoal from the paper instead of putting the charcoal in the tooth. Erasing graphite is much easier than charcoal, guys. Probably you know that if you're drawing with both mediums. So here, kneaded eraser can be used with graphite perfectly. What I'm doing here is just like I'm pressing the kneaded eraser and lifting the graphite, that's it. And each time we apply the eraser, we need to go blend with the tissue so that they have a more natural color. Here you see I added also some more eraser pencil details on the lip. Now let me show you how easy to erase the graphite. You see? And the best thing about erasing graphite, you don't damage the tooth very much. But with charcoal, sometimes erasing it will actually leave some marks. And besides, it might damage the tooth because we are trying so hard to erase. So let's talk about erasing charcoal. Here you see that once we blend the charcoal, it's much easier to erase. My eraser pencil is working perfectly here because this is the blended part. But if you try on a maybe line, that will be much difficult. Here, the kneaded eraser is lifting up the charcoal much easily, and also the quality of the paper here is important. Let me say that. I'm using vellum paper here. You have to have paper with tooth for charcoal. And here you can see that I'm adding details, but they're not sticking very well, and eraser is not working as well as it did with the graphite pencils. Here with the last touches, the last highlights with my kneaded eraser on charcoal, it works very well. Kneaded eraser works really well both with graphite and charcoal pencils. And because charcoal is so dark, these erasers create a great contrast. So drawing time. Now you're gonna ask me how long it took. Of course, when we compare, guys, it took much longer to draw with graphite because remember, we have to do layers, we have to apply as many layers as possible. So it took me 2 hours and 22 minutes to complete this portrait from beginning till end. And of course, the biggest times that it took were eyes and lips and hair and nose. And the shortest time it took was like for the clothing part. When it comes to the charcoal drawing took me 1 hour 40 minutes only, so it is like 42 minutes less than the graphite drawing. And you can see that the most challenging part for me was the eyes again and the lips, and nose too, I'm not gonna lie. And the easiest part was the clothing detail because it was so quick. It almost took me 5 minutes to do the whole clothing part, especially because of the photo. Once we talk about the timing, of course the hair was more practical too with charcoal because I created a dark base and then I just used my eraser a little bit, but for graphite it was much more work. So let's talk about depth. Well, depth-wise, I think charcoal has much more depth. But when you look at the eyes, because I could put in more details with graphite, I think eyes look much better in graphite in terms of detail. But when it comes to contrast, depth, I think charcoal is the winner here. The same thing happens with the lips, because the lips have more details in the graphite drawing one. But again, because of the shadows, I think it looks more realistic in the charcoal one. For some reason, I like the hair in both. I cannot really pick. One is more detailistic, one is like more dark. And the clothing too, I think the charcoal one is like too dark, but then the graphite one is too bright. So I cannot really make my mind up about that. But one thing I don't like about graphite is that I'm going to show you in a second that it actually shines. The graphite shines. Also, the eye lines, you can see that it was much better in the graphite one because I could use different degrees of my pencil, but with charcoal I didn't have that luxury. Let's talk about the shine of the graphite. Here, unfortunately, you can see how it's shining. Look at the left portrait and the left eye. It is difficult to not to have a shine with graphite pencils. So usually I highly recommend you to mix some maybe colored pencils or some charcoal with your graphite to prevent shining. I hope you found this video helpful, guys. What is your opinion though? What do you think? Let me know what you think in the comments section. I'll see you in my next video. Bye! Thanks for watching my video. If you like my videos, please don't forget to subscribe. And for my real-time narrated tutorials, visit my Patreon, patreon.com/Ece Gurler. Stay with art and love.